She was 24 when Callum Reed filed. There was no conversation, no final, fracturing argument in the clean, minimalist lines of their Edinburgh flat. There was only a letter. It was delivered not to the flat, but to her small, shared office at the university, a place he considered a charming but financially pointless hobby. A solicitor's letter, thick and cream-colored, handed to her by a departmental secretary with a look of pitying confusion. The language inside was as sterile as their apartment, precise, efficient, and utterly devoid of sentiment. It detailed the dissolution of their marriage of 22 months. It informed her that the joint account, which held the entirety of their shared savings and her last research grant stipend, had been legally frozen and its contents transferred to an account in his name alone, citing a prenuptial clause she barely remembered signing. It stated that the lease on the flat, which they had chosen together, had been renegotiated and was now his sole property. He was methodical. He took the Danish teak dining set they had bought at auction. He took the signed lithographs from the walls. He took the high-end espresso machine and the German kitchen knives. He took the digital records, the investment portfolios, the carefully curated life they had supposedly been building. He took everything that had a number attached to it, everything that could be appraised, catalogued, and entered onto a balance sheet. He was a private equity associate, and he treated the end of their marriage like the liquidation of a failed asset. Efficiently, ruthlessly, completely. He left her with her books, her clothes, and a small negative balance in her personal account. He never called. He never had to. The paperwork did all the talking. In his meticulous accounting, in his comprehensive sweep of their shared life, he had forgotten one thing. Or rather, he had never known of it. She had never told him about the Ferry house. She had tried once, early on, to describe the place her mother had left her 2 years prior. She spoke of the tidal estuary, the cry of the oyster catchers, the particular quality of the light on the water when the Har rolled in. He had smiled, a patient, indulgent smile, and said the Scottish coast was beautiful, of course, but economically inert. A lovely place to visit, but not a place where real value was generated. His dismissal was so complete, so uninterested, that she never brought it up again. It was a part of her he could not quantify, and so, to him, it did not exist. She had grown up understanding the tides the way some children grow up understanding silence in a library, or the particular cadence of a parent's footsteps. It was a fundamental language, an internal rhythm, set not by a clock, but by the moon. Her mother, Moira, had been the one to teach her. Moira Mackay was a woman who seemed to be composed of the very elements she studied. Quiet and deep like the estuary at slack water, but with an undercurrent of formidable strength. She was a marine biologist by training, but a tidal ecologist by soul. To Moira, the universe was not a collection of objects, but a series of overlapping cycles, and the constant ebb and flow of the sea was the most honest metronome of life itself. The Ferry house had been Moira's inheritance, and her father's before that. Isla's grandfather, Ewan Mackay, had been the last ferryman to work the crossing. He was a man of few words and powerful hands, a man who knew the estuary not from charts, but from the feel of the tiller and the sound of the water against the hull. He had lived his entire life in the small, sturdy stone house built at the edge of the landing, a structure designed to withstand the relentless assault of wind and salt. When the county council finally built a bridge 2 miles upstream, the ferry was decommissioned. The route, which had connected the two sides of the estuary for over 200 years, became obsolete overnight. Ewan, already a widower and nearing retirement, bought the ferry house and the small parcel of land it stood on from the council for a token sum. No one else wanted it. It was isolated, battered by the elements, and its purpose was gone. But for Ewan, its purpose had never been the ferry. Its purpose was to watch the water. He lived there for another decade, a quiet sentinel, until his heart gave out on a calm Tuesday during a neap tide. He left the house to Moira, his only child, a daughter who had inherited his quiet watchfulness and applied the rigors of science to it. Moira, already a young widow herself after Isla's fisherman father was taken by a sudden squall in the Minch, saw the Ferry house not as a relic, but as a perfectly situated laboratory. She moved her books, her microscopes, and her sampling equipment into the small rooms. She turned the main room, with its wide window facing the water, into a study. The old engine room, where a diesel generator had once provided power, became a storage space for her specimens and gear. She raised Isla there in the summers, between the academic terms in Aberdeen. For Moira, the house was not an asset to be leveraged. It was an anchor, a fixed point from which she could measure the constant, subtle changes of the world. She documented the slow decline of the eelgrass beds, the shifting patterns of migratory birds, the minute changes in salinity with each rainfall. She published papers in obscure journals, corresponded with scientists around the globe, and built a legacy of knowledge that was as deep and patient as the estuary itself. Her work was her life, and the Ferry house was its heart. It was a place of immense value that had absolutely no market price. This was a distinction Callum Reid could never have grasped. Isla's childhood memories were steeped in the scents and sounds of that place. The sharp, briny smell of low tide, the metallic tang of rust, the musty scent of her mother's old books, the rhythmic slap of water against the stone foundation, the lonely call of a curlew, the groan of the old building in a high wind. It was there she learned to read the water, to see the subtle signs of a changing current, to identify the dozens of species of seaweed by their texture and color. She and her mother would spend hours in waders on the mudflats, collecting samples, their conversations sparse but meaningful, punctuated by the shared joy of discovery. These were lessons not of acquisition, but of observation. They taught her a particular quality of attention, a way of seeing the world that valued process over product, understanding over ownership. It was this quality that Callum had first found so intriguing. He met her at a university function in Edinburgh, where she was finishing her master's thesis on submerged Neolithic structures. He was attentive in the specific way that lonely people find irresistible. He listened with an intensity that felt like a spotlight, asking sharp, insightful questions about her research. He was fascinated by the rigor of her work, the way she could reconstruct a forgotten world from the faintest of traces. He loved her mind, but he loved it as a collector loves a rare object, something to be admired for its complexity and uniqueness, but ultimately something to be possessed. Their short marriage had been a quiet, slow-motion collision of two fundamentally different ways of being. He saw her patience as a lack of ambition. He saw her deep connection to her past, to the long line of Mackays who had lived by this water, as a charming but impractical sentimentality. He encouraged her to apply for more prestigious, better-funded positions, to leverage her degree into a more lucrative career. He couldn't understand why she preferred the muddy, painstaking work of local coastal surveys to the gleaming, high-profile world of international antiquities. He saw her life as a series of choices that needed to be optimized for maximum return. She saw her life as a single, continuous thread, stretching back through her mother and her grandfather, a thread she was meant to follow, not to cut. The solicitor's letter was not the cause of the end. It was merely the final, formal acknowledgement that they had been living in two completely different worlds all along. With less than £300 in her pocket, the entirety of her liquid worth, Isla packed a single large suitcase and her worn leather field bag. The field bag was more important. It contained her survey notebooks, her brass calipers, a compass, her waterproof camera, and a set of cherished fine-tipped drawing pens. They were the tools of her trade, the implements of her way of seeing. She took a bus from Edinburgh, a long, rattling journey that slowly shed the city's gray stone elegance for the stark, open beauty of the north. She watched the landscape change through the smudged window, the rolling hills giving way to rugged coastline, the sky growing vast and expressive. With every mile she felt the tight knot of shock and betrayal in her chest begin to loosen, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. She was not running from something. She was returning to the only thing that had ever felt truly real. The solicitor in the small coastal town was a man named Alistair Blackwood, a contemporary of her grandfather's. His office smelled of old paper, leather, and pipe tobacco. He was a small, neat man with kind, watery eyes behind thick spectacles. He had handled her mother's will and had been holding the key for her. He looked at her with a gentle, knowing sorrow. He didn't ask about her husband or the reasons for her sudden appearance. The people in these parts had a deep respect for privacy and an innate understanding that life often delivered harsh blows. He simply nodded, retrieved a small, heavy box from his safe, and placed it on the desk between them. "Your mother was a fine woman, Idla," he said, his voice soft. "A credit to this place. She knew its worth." He pushed the box towards her. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, large iron key. It was pitted with rust, heavy and cold in her hand. It felt less like a key and more like an anchor. He had her sign a few papers, the formal transfer of the deed into her name alone. The property was listed with a nominal value of £1 for tax purposes. It was officially worthless. She walked the half-mile from the town, down the muddy, rutted track that led to the ferry house. The air was thick with the smell of salt and wet earth. The place was just as she remembered it from her last visit before her mother's final illness, only more so. The North Sea weather had been at work. The corrugated iron roof was a tapestry of brilliant orange rust. The white paint on the timber walls was peeling in long, curling strips, revealing the weathered gray wood beneath. The windows were opaque, filmed over with a thick crust of dried salt spray. It looked derelict, abandoned, a forgotten outpost at the edge of the world. But as she got closer, she saw what her mother and grandfather had always seen. The foundation was a marvel of dry stone construction, massive blocks of granite that had been locked together without a speck of mortar, settled deep into the land. The structure itself was square and solid, hunkered down against the wind. It had been built not for beauty, but for endurance. It had good bones. It was still standing. So was she. The iron key turned in the lock with a loud, grating groan, the sound of long disuse. The door swung inward on protesting hinges, opening into the cold, still air of the main room. A fine layer of dust covered everything, softening the edges of the familiar objects within. Her mother's enormous chart table, its surface scarred with decades of calculations and drawings, dominated the space. Bookshelves overflowed with texts on marine biology, oceanography, local history, and Gaelic poetry. Brass instruments, a barometer, a sextant, a tide clock, gleamed dully on the walls. It smelled of her childhood, salt, damp stone, engine oil, and the particular papery scent of her mother's library. It was a time capsule, a sanctuary, a ruin. It was home. For a long moment, she simply stood in the doorway, letting the profound silence of the place settle over her. Then she moved with a purpose that surprised her. She went past the main room, through the small galley kitchen, and into the old engine room at the back. It was the coldest part of the house, built directly into the bedrock of the shoreline. The air was heavy and damp. The old generator was long gone, but the concrete plinth it had rested on remained, and the walls were thick, unpainted stone, slick with condensation. She ran her hand along the cold, rough surface, feeling for the memory of a childhood game. Her mother had called it finding the ferryman's treasure. She searched for a specific stone, one that was slightly recessed with a different texture from the others. Her fingers found it almost immediately. Using the sharp end of a geological hammer from her field bag, she carefully worked at the old mortar around the stone. It crumbled easily, turning to dust. After a few minutes of patient work, the stone was loose enough to pull free. It came away with a soft scraping sound, revealing a dark, square cavity within the thick wall. Reaching inside, her fingers brushed against the cold, smooth surface of metal. She pulled it out. It was a copper box, about the size of a shoebox, its surface patinated with a green verdigris. It was heavy, and the lid had been sealed shut with a thick bead of solder. Her mother, ever the pragmatist, had made it watertight. Isla carried the box back to the chart table, the only clear surface in the room. She used the hammer and a small chisel to carefully break the solder seal. The lid lifted off with a soft hiss of air. Inside, the contents were perfectly preserved. The top layer consisted of bundles of old 20-pound notes held together with brittle rubber bands. Beneath them were canvas bags, heavy with the weight of coins. She emptied one onto the table. They weren't modern currency. They were old silver shillings, florins, and heavy crowns, coins from her grandfather's time, saved over a lifetime of modest earnings. She spent the next hour counting, her hands dusty with the residue of old money and forgotten time. The cash amounted to just over 30,000 pounds. The silver, at its melt value, was probably worth another 10. It was a small fortune, saved in secret by a woman who had little use for money, but a deep understanding of the need for security. It was enough. It was enough to begin again. At the very bottom of the box, lying flat, was a folded piece of paper. It wasn't paper, she realized as she carefully unfolded it. It was a section of an old, decommissioned nautical chart of the estuary, the paper thick and soft with age. On the back, written in her mother's neat, precise script, was a letter. "My dearest Isla," it began. "If you are reading this, then you have need of it. And for that, I am sorry. I hope life has been kind to you, but I know that kindness is not always a constant. Your grandfather saved this money, and I added to it. He used to say that a person needs 2 things in this life: a place to stand, and the means to keep standing there. This is the means. The house is the place. Do not mistake this for a house, my love. It is an instrument. It is a lens for looking at the world. Its purpose is to help you see things clearly. Do not worry about the rust or the peeling paint. The foundation is sound. You and Mackay built it to last. The roof, however, will need attention. The slater to call is Alistair Ross in the village. His father did the roof for my father. He is an honest man. Tell him it is for Moira's lass. He will understand. I know you have a good mind, Isla, a brilliant mind, but do not let it live only in the past, in the world of books and ancient stones. Use your hands. Fix this place. Learn its mechanics, its weaknesses. You will find a different kind of knowledge in that work, a knowledge that settles in the bones. The world will try to tell you what has value. It will speak of markets and returns and growth. That is their language. It is not ours. This place has no market value, Isla. That is its strength. It cannot be bought or sold, only inhabited and understood. Its true worth is in the turning of the tide, in the resilience of the eelgrass, in the faithfulness of the stars. It is a quiet worth, but it is real, and it cannot be taken from you. Be watchful. Be patient. The water will teach you everything you need to know. All my love, Mother. Isla sat there in the cold, dusty room, the letter in her hands, and cried. She wept not with grief for her mother, but with a profound, aching sense of recognition. The letter was not just a set of instructions. It was a validation of her entire being. It was her mother's voice, clear and true, cutting through the noise of Callum's world, reminding her of who she was. She read the letter again and again, the words a balm on the raw wound of her recent life. When she finally looked up, the light outside had softened, the afternoon sun breaking through the clouds and casting long shadows across the water. She had her means, she had her place to stand. It was time to get to work. Oh, the next morning she called Alistair Ross. An older man with a soft, lilting voice answered the phone. She explained who she was, and there was a pause on the line. "Moira's lass," he said, his voice warm with recognition. I remember you as a wee thing, always covered in mud and chasing crabs. Your mother was a fine woman. I'll be out this afternoon to have a look." He arrived in a battered pickup truck, a man in his late 60s with hands that looked as if they had been carved from oak. He walked around the Ferry house, squinting up at the roof, his expression unreadable. He poked at the window frames, tested the downspouts, and finally came back to where she stood waiting, a knot of anxiety in her stomach. "She's a bit tired," he said with masterful understatement. "But the bones are good. Your grandfather built her right." He quoted her a price for a new slate roof and 6 new marine-grade windows. It was a fair price, a shockingly fair price. "We'll start on Monday if that suits," he said. "And don't you worry, we'll make her tight again for you." Isla didn't just watch the work. She participated in it. She became Alistair's unofficial apprentice. She learned the heft and balance of a slate hammer. She learned how to mix mortar to the perfect consistency, a skill that felt surprisingly similar to preparing sediment samples. She spent long days on the scaffolding, her muscles aching, her hands raw, her face chapped by the wind. She hauled slates, cleared away the old rusted iron sheets, and helped Alistair and his young nephew set the new, dark gray stones in neat, overlapping rows. The work was hard, repetitive, and deeply satisfying. Each perfectly placed slate was a small victory against the chaos that had upended her life. She was not just repairing a roof, she was rebuilding her own foundation, slate by careful slate. Alistair was a patient teacher, a man who spoke the language of wood, stone, and weather. He shared stories of her grandfather, of the legendary storms the Ferry house had weathered. "Your granda used to say this house was like a limpet," he told her one afternoon, as they sat on the scaffolding sharing a flask of tea. "The harder the storm blows, the tighter it clings to the rock." With the house finally watertight and the new windows installed, letting in clear, unobstructed light for the first time in years, Isla turned her attention to the interior. This was a different kind of work, more personal, more intimate. She began by cleaning. For 2 solid weeks she scrubbed. She scrubbed away the layers of salt and grime, the residue of time and neglect. She washed the walls, sanded and oiled the old wooden floorboards until they glowed with a soft, warm patina. She cleaned every single one of her mother's books, dusting the covers, mending torn pages. She polished the brass on the barometer and the tide clock until they shone. This wasn't an act of erasure. It was an act of reverence. She was not trying to remove her mother's presence, but to honor it, to make the space clean and ready for its next chapter. Slowly, she began to make the place her own. She bought a small, efficient wood-burning stove and installed it herself, following the instructions with a marine archaeologist's attention to detail. The first fire she lit filled the room with a flickering light and a dry, welcome heat that seemed to chase the last of the damp from the very stones. She arranged her own books on the shelves alongside her mother's, the texts on Neolithic pottery sitting comfortably next to volumes on tidal hydrodynamics. She set up her own microscope on the chart table, positioning it to catch the best morning light. She bought a simple bed, a sturdy table, and 2 chairs. She didn't need much. The house itself, with its expansive view of the ever-changing estuary, was the main furnishing. The space was no longer just her mother's laboratory. It was becoming her home, a place that held both her past and her future. Once the house was habitable, she knew she needed work. The money from her mother was a lifeline, but it was finite. She saw an advertisement for a part-time position with the newly formed Regional Marine Heritage Trust, a small organization dedicated to surveying and preserving the archaeological sites along the coast. The job was for a finds cataloger, a junior position, but it was work in her field. She applied, not expecting much. The director of the trust was a woman named Dr. Arlene Evans, a respected academic from St. Andrews. During the interview, Dr. Evans looked over Isla's CV. "Mackay," she said, her eyes lighting up. "Are you any relation to Moira Mackay, the biologist who worked out of the old Ferry house?" Isla nodded. She was my mother." Dr. Evans smiled. Her work on tidal scour effects on coastal middens was groundbreaking. Required reading for my postgraduates. She understood this coastline better than anyone. She hired Isla on the spot. The work was perfect. It allowed her to use her professional skills while giving her the flexibility to continue her own research. The trust office was in the town, a short walk from the Ferry house. Her supervisor didn't just see a young, recently divorced woman in need of a job. She saw the inheritor of a valuable and specific legacy of knowledge. On her days off, Isla began her own personal project, the work she had been born to do. She started a systematic archaeological survey of the estuary itself. The area had been inhabited for thousands of years, and the shifting tides constantly revealed and concealed traces of its past. Neolithic fish traps made of stone, the submerged remains of ancient piers, shards of medieval pottery worn smooth by the water. She used the Ferry house as her base of operations, just as her mother had. She would rise before dawn, consult the tide charts, and head out onto the mudflats in her waders, her field bag slung over her shoulder. The work was slow, quiet, and demanded absolute concentration. It was a conversation with time itself, a process of listening to the faint whispers of the past. She would spend hours bent over a survey grid, her fingers numb with cold, completely absorbed, completely at peace. She was a Mackay, on Mackay land, doing Mackay work. She had never felt more herself. As the seasons turned, from the harsh winds of winter to the gentle light of spring, the local community began to embrace her presence. It was a slow, quiet acceptance. An elderly fisherman named Tam, who had known her grandfather, started leaving a couple of fresh mackerel on her doorstep once a week. A retired botanist, who had corresponded with her mother for years about the salt marsh flora, came by with a gift of rare seeds for her small garden. They would sit with her, drink tea, and share stories. They spoke of her mother's fierce intelligence, her grandfather's quiet dependability. They saw her not as an outsider, but as the rightful heir to a place they all respected. They talked about Callum Reid only once. Tam, looking out at the water, said, "Some men only know how to take. They don't have the patience for a place like this. Or a woman like your mother." He looked at Isla. "Or you." It was the highest compliment she had ever received. It was a Tuesday morning in late February, almost a year to the day since she had arrived. A vicious, slate-gray sky hung low over the water, and a biting wind drove sheets of rain against the new windows of the Ferry house. Isla was out on the estuary, as she was most mornings, working in the sucking mud of the extreme low tide. She was examining a newly exposed line of wooden stakes that she believed were part of a Bronze Age walkway. She was completely absorbed, the wind and rain a familiar soundtrack to her concentration. That was why she didn't immediately notice the car. It was a sleek, black Audi, utterly incongruous against the wild landscape, its tires spinning uselessly in the deep mud of the track. Callum got out. He was wearing a dark, beautifully tailored cashmere coat and a pair of expensive leather brogues that were instantly ruined by the thick, clinging mud. He stood for a moment, looking at the Ferry house. He saw the new, solid roof, the clean, clear windows, the thin plume of wood smoke rising from the chimney. He saw a place that was not a ruin, but a fortress, a home. His expression was one of profound bewilderment, the look of a man whose calculations had been proven fundamentally wrong. He spotted her then, a small, solitary figure in dark green waders, 100 yards out on the glistening mudflats. He shouted her name. The wind snatched the sound and tore it to pieces. He shouted again, louder this time. Isla looked up, her focus broken. She saw him, a dark, foreign shape on the shoreline. She straightened up but made no move to come in. She simply watched him, her hand shielding her eyes from the rain. He started walking towards the water's edge, his movements awkward and angry in the treacherous mud. "Isla!" he yelled. "What is this? I heard you'd moved up here, but I had no idea." He gestured at the ferry house. "A friend from the firm was looking at coastal wind farm investments. Your name came up. The deed was registered. I suppose my due diligence wasn't as thorough as I thought." It was a confession, but it was framed as a business error, a lapse in his otherwise perfect accounting. He stopped at the edge of the solid ground, the waterlogged mud barring his way. He wouldn't or couldn't step into it. "Can you come in?" he shouted over the wind. "We need to talk." Isla didn't move from her spot. She was grounded, literally, in the middle of her work, in the middle of her life. She was on her own territory. He was the one who was displaced. Her voice, when she replied, was calm and clear, carried cleanly back to him on the wind. "You never asked, Callum," she said. "It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. In 2 years, you never once asked about my mother's home. You never asked about this place." He looked flustered, a rare sight. He was a man accustomed to being in control, to setting the terms of every engagement. Here he had no leverage. The wind whipped his expensive coat around him. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead. He looked small and out of place. He tried a different tack, the one he always used when logic failed, a vague appeal to a shared history he had already liquidated. "Isla, is there anything we can do?" he asked, his voice softer, almost pleading. "To fix this?" She looked at him, a man she had once loved, a man who had tried to erase her. She felt no anger, no bitterness. She felt only a great, calm distance. She thought of the letter, of the tides, of the quiet, enduring strength of the stone walls behind her. She thought of the real value, the unquantifiable worth he was congenitally incapable of seeing. "No," she said, her voice quiet but absolute. "There isn't." The word hung in the air between them, as final and immovable as the bedrock beneath her feet. He stared at her for a long moment, the rain dripping from his chin. He was a master of negotiation, of finding an angle, of closing a deal. But he was faced with a simple, unassailable truth. There was nothing here for him to acquire. He had already taken everything he was capable of valuing. Without another word, he turned, squelched his way back through the mud to his car, and drove away. Isla watched until the car disappeared. Then she turned back to her work, her eyes once again on the ancient, half-buried stones. That night the storm passed. The sky cleared, revealing a vast, crystalline spread of stars and a brilliant full moon that laid a shimmering silver path across the estuary. Isla didn't stay inside. She took a chair out onto the small, sturdy stone pier her grandfather had built, the same pier where her mother had taught her the names of the constellations. She wrapped herself in a thick woolen blanket and sat, watching the tide turn. The water, which had been at its lowest ebb that morning, was now coming in, a slow, silent, and immensely powerful flood. It covered the mudflats where she had worked, submerged the ancient walkway, and rose steadily up the stone foundations of her home. She thought about the generations of her family who had watched this same moon, this same tide. Her grandfather, the ferryman, who had measured his life in crossings. Her mother, the scientist, who had measured it in cycles of growth and decay. And now her, the archaeologist, measuring it in the slow uncovering of the past. They were all watchers, all students of this place. Their legacy was not one of ownership, but of attention. They hadn't possessed the estuary, they had belonged to it. She thought of Callum. He lived in a world of sharp lines and clear figures, of profit and loss. He saw a coastline and calculated its potential for wind energy yield. He saw a marriage and calculated its net asset value. He was a man who could only see what could be counted. He could count the money in a bank account, the square footage of a flat, the thread count of a sheet. He could not count the value of a story told by a fisherman, the knowledge in a forgotten letter, or the peace that came from watching the moon on the water. His world was loud, fast, and transactional. Hers was quiet, slow, and generational. She felt a deep, quiet pity for him. He had so much, and he possessed so little. Her inheritance, she finally understood, was not the house or the money or the land. It was the clarity. It was the ability to see the difference between a price and a value. It was the knowledge, settled deep in her bones, that the most important things in life are the ones that can never be entered on a ledger. The tide reached its peak, a moment of perfect, glassy stillness before its inevitable retreat. She felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost a physical presence. She was home. Callum Reid had taken everything he could document. He had taken the flat, the savings, the jointly owned art. He had taken everything he could count. He forgot the rusted ferry house her mother left. It was the best thing he ever forgot.